At the beginning of the 20th century, gasoline engines were limited by a violent metallic rattle called knock, the premature detonation that shattered pistons and wasted fuel. Charles Franklin Kettering, who had already revolutionized motoring with the electric self-starter, decided that conquering knock was the next frontier. He opened an experimental station in Dayton, Ohio, and assigned the young engineer Thomas Midgley, Jr. the task of screening additives. Between 1919 and 1921, Midgley vaporized literally tens of thousands of substances in glass flasks, listening for the softest flame. Ethyl alcohol did suppress knock, but it could be produced by any distiller and therefore offered no patent monopoly. The turning point arrived in December 1921, when Midgley stirred a few drops of a heavy, sweet-smelling liquid called tetrethyl lead into 1 liter of gasoline. The engine purred, the hammering vanished, and the cost was negligible because the raw material was common metallic lead. Within months, Kettering filed a cascade of patents and, together with Standard Oil and DuPont, created the Ethyl Gasoline Corporation to license the additive worldwide. Public promotion followed theatrical logic. In April 1923, Midgley invited journalists to the General Motors showroom in Detroit, poured the colorless additive over his bare hands, waved a cloth soaked with its vapor under his nose, and declared it harmless when handled with ordinary care. The demonstration impressed a nation already fascinated by speed. Motor car makers such as Packard, Chrysler, and Cadillac launched new high-compression models advertised as powered by ethyl. For motorists, the promise was irresistible. More power, less pinging, and improved mileage without paying premium for highly refined fuel. Yet inside the pilot plants that produced the additive, workers had begun to stagger, tremble, and babble. The liquid's capacity to silence engines concealed a darker talent for silencing neurons. Nevertheless, the commercial train gathered momentum. What engineers loved above all was the infinitesimal dose required. A few parts per million of tetrethyl, lead intercepted the chain reactions that caused knock, so refineries could keep using simple straight-run gasoline instead of costly aromatics. For the oil majors, the additive was the perfect marriage of chemistry and finance, a private patent grafted onto a public commodity. By the summer of 1923, filling stations from New Jersey to Illinois advertised the new fuel, stamped with a red ethyl shield guaranteeing superior octane. The press spoke of a miracle liquid that would unlock the modern motorway age. No regulator demanded long-term toxicological data, and no federal law compelled the companies to provide it. Thus, almost overnight, a compound described by industrial memos as extremely poisonous was injected into the bloodstream of American transportation. The seeds of a technological triumph and a looming public health disaster were now embedded in the freshly paved highways of a nation on the move. Triumph turned into alarm in the autumn of 1924. At Standard Oil's Bayway refinery in New Jersey, the section where tetrethyl lead was blended acquired the macabre nickname Loony Gas Building because workers emerged confused, hallucinating, or violently agitated. Between September and October, 5 men died after short bouts of convulsions. Dozens more were admitted to psychiatric wards. Newspapers headlined the incidents as "gasoline that drives men insane." Charles Norris, the celebrated New York City medical examiner, together with toxicologist Alexander Gettler, performed autopsies revealing swollen brains and cellular inclusions typical of heavy metal poisoning. Norris declared that tetrethyl lead was one of the most dangerous substances to human life that has ever been discovered. Several states imposed temporary bans, and the federal spotlight turned on the young additive. General Motors, Standard Oil, and DuPont responded with a united public relations offensive. They argued that the deaths were tragic accidents caused by improper factory ventilation, not by the finished fuel, where the concentration of the additive was 1,000 times lower. To calm markets, the Surgeon General convened a conference in Washington in May 1925 that gathered physiologists, industrial chemists, and public health officials. After 2 days of debate, the panel concluded that use of tetrethyl lead was acceptable, provided industrial safeguards were improved. The moratoriums were lifted, production resumed. The episode taught industry a crucial lesson. Panic had to be preempted by a facade of expert science. Robert A. Kehoe, newly appointed director of the Kettering Laboratory at the University of Cincinnati, began long-term studies funded by Ethel Corporation that aimed to reframe the issue. He proposed that there existed a natural background of lead in human bodies, and that only exposures raising average blood levels above that background should worry regulators. This argument, soon dubbed the Kehoe principle, shifted the burden of proof onto critics and became the dominant toxicological doctrine for decades. Meanwhile, the dead workers of Bayway faded into the background of industrial fatality statistics, and public imagination returned to the thrill of motoring advancement. The additive's mercury-like threat to the nervous system remained largely invisible because the general public inhaled it in micrograms, not milligrams per day. Yet the gift of speed carried a silent invoice that children, rather than factory hands, would eventually pay. With the Bayway scandal apparently settled, Ethel Corporation embarked on an international licensing campaign. In 1927, company officials met in Paris with executives from British, German, Italian, and Soviet oil firms, signing contracts that spread the additive across 5 continents. Aviation engineers, striving for ever higher compression ratios, embraced leaded fuel enthusiastically. During the Second World War, the additive became a strategic asset, credited with giving Allied aircraft superior power and range. The scientific foundation for this expansion was anchored in Robert Kehoe's laboratory. Funded by the manufacturers, Kehoe monitored blood lead levels in smelter workers and volunteers exposed to small airborne doses. He concluded that concentrations below 0.02 of 1 milligram per 100 milliliters of blood represented an innocent background. Because urban residents already hovered near that figure, almost any increase could be waved away as insignificant. Regulatory agencies adopted the benchmark, effectively guaranteeing that average citizens would never be judged overexposed. Opponents carried the impossible burden of proving harm at levels officially deemed safe. Throughout the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, global automobile ownership soared, pouring billions of liters of leaded exhaust into the air each year. Fine oxide particles drifted over playgrounds, kitchen gardens, and baby prams. A handful of independent physicians raised warnings. The Australian pediatrician Randolph Byers noted cognitive impairments in Boston children whose homes bordered busy traffic corridors. Israeli-born physiologist Yandel Henderson described an invisible epidemic of subclinical poisoning. Their work, however, struggled to pass peer review in journals whose advertising pages were dominated by engine manufacturers and oil companies. Meanwhile, auto designers exploited the additive's protective veil. They introduced 8-cylinder, high-compression motors whose marketing slogans trumpeted rocket-like acceleration. Trade magazines portrayed tetrethyl lead as an essential ingredient of modern life, no more optional than electric light. Even the newly created United Nations listed leaded fuel as a developmental necessity for emerging economies. Yet change was stirring in a small basement laboratory at the California Institute of Technology. A meticulous geochemist named Clair Patterson, obsessed with calculating the precise age of Earth, was building the first ultra-clean room in scientific history. In trying to clean microscopic lead contamination from meteorite samples, he would soon discover that the atmosphere itself was contaminated 100-fold beyond natural levels. The data he would publish during the next decade would shake the Kehoe principle to its core. Clair Patterson's initial problem was geological, not medical. He needed to measure the minutest traces of lead inside meteoritic crystals in order to refine radiometric dating techniques. The instruments read absurdly high values. Patterson realized the contamination came from common laboratory air, thick with automobile exhaust. He sealed his workspace, pumped it full of filtered air, and devised cleaning rituals that anticipated the semiconductor industry. Not only did he succeed in calculating Earth's age at 4,550,000,000 years, he also gained a tool for tracing anthropogenic lead. By sampling Greenland snow layers, deep ocean sediments, and Californian coastal fog, Patterson demonstrated a dramatic spike in lead concentrations coinciding with the era of automobiles. Even more telling, the isotopic fingerprint of modern deposits matched that of industrial lead used in gasoline refineries. In 1965, he published Contaminated and Natural Lead Environments of Man, showing that the average citizen breathed and ingested at least 100 times more lead than prehistoric humans. Robert Kehoe dismissed the findings as alarmist, but the methodological rigor was unassailable. The National Research Council formed a special committee which, a year later, acknowledged Patterson's evidence and called for large-scale epidemiological studies. Industry retaliated. Funding to Patterson was cut, access to refinery sites revoked, and public relations departments issued glossy brochures asserting that there was no demonstrated danger. Yet popular magazines such as Life and Time began citing Patterson, and Senator Edmund Muskie convened congressional hearings on airborne lead. Parallel technological currents amplified the tension. Chemists Eugene Howdrey and Paul Hagen were perfecting catalytic converters capable of stripping carbon monoxide and unburned hydrocarbons from automobile exhaust. The new devices, however, were poisoned by even trace amounts of lead. Thus, engineers who wished to meet forthcoming air quality standards joined environmental doctors in demanding unleaded fuel. By the mid-1960s, the once unanimous chorus praising tetraethyl lead had fractured. A policy window was opening. The United States Congress passed the Clean Air Act in 1970, granting the Environmental Protection Agency sweeping authority over automotive emissions. Growing pediatric evidence, including studies by Herbert Needleman, indicated that blood lead concentrations well below 10 micrograms per deciliter impaired learning and behavior. In 1973, the Environmental Protection Agency issued a schedule. From the 1st of January 1975, new cars would require catalytic converters and thus only unleaded gasoline. Concurrently, the permissible lead content in other grades would be lowered in stages from 3 grams per gallon to 1 gram, then to 1/10 of a gram by 1986. Ethyl Corporation sued, alleging regulatory overreach. In 1976, the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia upheld the agency, ruling that protecting public health justified preventive action. Consumption of the additive plunged by half within 4 years. The price gap between unleaded and leaded fuel narrowed as refineries adopted catalytic reforming and oxygenated additives, such as methyl tertiary butyl ether. National Health and Nutrition Examination surveys documented a precipitous 78% decline in average blood lead among adults between 1976 and 1991. In children aged 1 to 5, the reduction was even steeper. Educators reported improved attention spans and reading scores in inner-city classrooms previously choked by traffic fumes. By 1985, the Environmental Protection Agency proposed a complete ban for on-road vehicles. After final courtroom skirmishes, leaded gasoline for automotive use became illegal nationwide on 29 January 1996. Fewer than 2% of the nation's fuel volume still contained the additive, destined mainly for antiquated farm machinery. The American turnaround triggered a cascade abroad. Trades in tetrethyl lead futures collapsed, and Ethyl Corporation, soon renamed Afton Chemical, pivoted away from organolead chemistry. Inspired by American success, the European Union adopted Directive 1998/70, capping lead at 0.15 grams per liter from the year 2000 and mandating total prohibition 5 years later. Italy received a short derogation until 2002 to empty storage of the traditional super grade. Japan had already moved earlier, leveraging strict emission rules and domestic electronics to eliminate lead by 1986. In developing regions, the transition proved harder. Many African refineries processed crude that yielded naturally low-octane fuels, historically upgraded with tetrethyl lead. The United Nations Environment Program launched the Partnership for Clean Fuels and Vehicles, offering technical grants to modernize refineries, import higher-octane blends, and promote ethanol. By 2011, most sub-Saharan nations had banned leaded gasoline, but smuggling persisted along clandestine routes. The final legal holdout was Algeria. After refurbishing the Skikda refinery with loans from the Islamic Development Bank, Algerian authorities stopped sales on the 1st of July 2021. 8 weeks later, the United Nations celebrated the end of leaded petrol era, estimating annual benefits of more than 1 million avoided premature deaths, and an economic gain exceeding 2% of global output. Two niches remained: small piston-engine aircraft, which relied on 100 low-lead aviation gasoline, and certain motorsport categories. In 2023, the United States Federal Aviation Administration granted fleet-wide approval to a new unleaded fuel called G100 Ultra Low, while the International Automobile Federation banned leaded blends in all major racing series from the 2026 season onward. Leaded gasoline, once ubiquitous, had been confined to historical curiosities and shrinking corners of aviation. Once ambient lead fell, scientists could better quantify harm at very low doses. In 2002, the Centers for Disease Control lowered the pediatric intervention level from 10 to 5 micrograms per deciliter, and in 2021 to 3.5. Meta-analyses led by Bruce Lanphier showed that 90% of intelligence quotient loss occurs between 0 and 10 micrograms per deciliter, overturning earlier linear assumptions. Economists such as Elise Gould and Leonardo Trisande converted intelligence quotient point gains into monetary value, concluding that the United States saves tens of billions of dollars each year in increased productivity and reduced medical costs. Cardiovascular studies pooling more than 30 international cohorts linked childhood exposure to hypertension and adult heart attacks, with a clear dose response and no safe threshold. A controversial but intriguing strand of criminology, advanced by Richard Nevin and Jessica Wolpaw-Reyes, correlated falling urban lead levels with drops in violent crime 20 years later. After adjusting for poverty, unemployment, and demographic change, their models produced coefficients of determination above 0.8. Experimental work on rodents supports biological plausibility, showing that early life lead impairs the dopamine and inhibitory circuits of the prefrontal cortex, the brain's impulse control center. Environmental geochemists meanwhile tracked the additive's retreat across the planet. Using inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, Dominic Weiss recorded a 50% decrease in lead concentrations within Antarctic snow layers compared with peak values in the 1970s. The data proved that policy decisions made in Washington, Brussels, and Tokyo echo even across the world's most remote continent. The wider message is clear: eliminating a single industrial additive has delivered benefits spanning cognitive health, economic equity, and atmospheric chemistry. It is a textbook example of how targeted environmental regulation can produce measurable, rapid, and far-reaching gains. The arc of tetrethyl lead teaches that technological quick fixes without prior hazard evaluation can impose colossal external costs. Ethyl alcohol, a safer anti-knock agent, was available in 1922, but rejected because it could not be patented. The Kehoe principle illustrates how commercial interests may shape regulatory baselines when independent research is underfunded. Conversely, Clair Patterson's career demonstrates the pivotal role of precision measurement in revealing unseen dangers. Politically, the phase-out shows that binding limits outperform voluntary pledges. Where governments enforced deadlines, industry innovated. Where they hesitated, lead lingered. Public health benefits emerged quickly. In cities that banned lead, pediatric blood levels plummeted within 3 years, proving that many harms are reversible for future cohorts. Looking ahead, the story urges caution toward novel organometallic additives in batteries and toward cerium-based nanoparticles proposed as fuel-borne catalysts. We must avoid replaying the same drama in which a short-term technical benefit eclipses long-term ecotoxicity. The residual challenge of aviation gasoline hints at the need for targeted incentives and collaborative certification pathways. The fleet-wide approval of G100 Ultra-Low required a decade of coordinated work among regulators, universities, and engine makers, yet now promises to remove the largest remaining source of airborne lead in the United States. In sum, the saga of leaded gasoline is not merely a closed historical chapter. It remains an active reminder that science, industry, and policy must evolve together, maintaining transparency, independence, and swift action to safeguard global health.